Hey everyone, welcome back to the deep dive. We're all about getting to the heart of things here, cutting through all the noise and finding those real aha moments, those insights that make you go, whoa, I never thought of it that way before, without, getting lost in a sea of information. And today we're diving into something so fundamental, it affects pretty much every part of our lives, how we can all, in a way, act as philosophers.
And by that, we don't mean sitting around in armchairs and pondering the meaning of life, although that's cool too. It's more about looking at those everyday situations where we have choices to make, strategies to consider, especially when other people with their own goals are involved. We're talking about understanding that hidden logic, those underlying structures that shape our interactions, especially when you're playing games.
Because, let's face it, life's kind of like a giant game, right?
Yeah.
But games in a broader sense.
Yeah.
And that's why we're taking this deep dive into the surprisingly fascinating connection between logic and games.
Yeah, you might think logic is all about dusty old textbooks and, abstract reasoning. But when you pair it with games, things start to click. It's like this amazing lens that helps us analyze strategic thinking, how we make decisions, and yeah, even how we act as philosophers when faced with choices.
Turns out the way we approach, say, a simple game of rock, paper, scissors, or even a super complex negotiation, it's deeply connected to these logical principles. It's all happening under the surface, whether we're aware of it or not.
That's right. And to guide us through this, we're going to be drawing on a really in-depth resource, the Logics for Analyzing Games entry from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Now, this is like a gold mine of information. It shows how formal logic gives us these powerful tools to understand the basic structures, the players, and the dynamic in all kinds of games.
And remember, when we say games here, we're not just talking about board games or video games. It's much broader than that. It's any situation where you have multiple agents, think people, organizations, maybe even computer systems, who have goals and are making choices that affect each other. It's about that strategic interaction.
So our mission today is to take this rich academic resource and distill it down to its essence. We want to reveal those surprising connections between formal logic and the way we think strategically every single day.
We're going to break down what might seem like complicated ideas into these, clear, bite-sized pieces of knowledge that will help you see the world and especially those interactions in a new light, like a philosopher might.
Okay, so let's get started. Now, one of the first things that struck me is that the connection between logic and games is not some newfangled idea. It's actually been around for centuries.
Right. It goes way back. Think about it. Even an argument can be seen as a kind of game. You take turns, you make your points, you try to be persuasive, and in the end, someone's argument wins, right? Or maybe you reach some kind of draw. It's a structured interaction with strategy at its core.
I like that. Like a verbal game of strategy.
Exactly. And historically, people actually used special logic games, back in the Middle Ages, to train their reasoning skills. It was like mental gymnastics for philosophers. And then later on, these more formal dialogue games became a way to understand the foundations of logic itself. The idea was that constructing a solid logical proof was like winning an argument based on clear rules.
So it wasn't just a playful comparison. This link between games and logic ran deep.
Absolutely. And this connection's only become stronger over time. Today, logic and game theory are intertwined across a huge range of fields, not just in, game theory itself, but in linguistics, computer science, even economics.
So understanding this link between logic and games is not just an intellectual curiosity. It has really practical implications for how we analyze and navigate all kinds of interactions, from simple everyday exchanges to complex negotiations.
Right. It helps us all act as philosophers in a way, approaching interactions with a bit more awareness and understanding of what's really going on beneath the surface.
So the source that goes into deconstructing strategic interaction, and it starts with this seemingly simple question. Why do players in a game act the way they do?
Hmm.
It sounds straightforward, but when you really think about it, like a philosopher might, there are a lot of layers there.
So many layers. Because even in the simplest game, you have actions, outcomes, and then it gets more interesting. You have to consider what each player knows about the game, what their preferences are, what they believe the other players are going to do.
It's like this whole web of interconnected factors that shape every decision.
Exactly. And then there are those what-if scenarios, those counterfactual conditionals that the source talks about. Players are constantly thinking, okay, if I do this, what would my opponent do? And if they do that, what would I do then? It's this constant process of hypothetical reasoning, and it's key to strategic thinking.
So it's not just about the pure logic of what might be the best move in isolation.
Mm.
It's about the logic of what's the best move given your understanding of the other player, their motivations, their likely actions. It's like a philosophical assessment of the situation, right?
Yeah, exactly. And logic gives us some pretty awesome tools to analyze these complex situations. The source mentions formal languages, for example. We can use them to describe the basic properties of a game in a very precise way.
So it's like creating specialized language to talk about the game itself.
Exactly. And then there are these things called model checking techniques, which can be used to check if those properties hold true in a specific game. It's like having a way to automatically verify if certain conditions are met based on those formal descriptions. Very efficient, very precise.
It's like a philosopher using their tools to break down a complex argument, right?
Yeah.
Analyzing each part, making sure it all fits together logically.
Exactly. Now, the source gives a really cool example here about winning strategies using a game tree. For anyone who's not familiar, a game tree is basically a diagram that maps out all the possible moves in a game. It starts from the beginning and branches out to all the possible endings.
So it's a way to visualize all the different paths the game could take.
Exactly. And in figure 2 of the source, they have this game where player E has a guaranteed winning strategy against player A. It means no matter what player A does, player E can always make a sequence of moves that leads to victory.
And that's where logic comes in, right? It gives us a way to express this idea of a guaranteed win with absolute precision.
Right. They use this modal logic formula, move angle line. Might look intimidating, but it's actually very elegant.
Okay, break it down for us. What does each part of that formula mean?
So move is a universal modality, and it means for all possible moves by player A is an existential modality, meaning there exists at least one move by player E, and line simply means player E wins.
So when you put it all together, it's basically saying no matter what player A does, there's always at least one move player E can make that leads to them winning.
Exactly. It captures the idea of a guaranteed win perfectly. And what's really cool is that even the most basic logical laws, like the law of excluded middle, can have significant implications for game theory when applied to these kinds of formulas. It shows how deeply intertwined these two fields really are.
The law of excluded middle, that's the one that says something is either true or false.
Right.
No middle ground.
Exactly. And in the context of games, that translates to some pretty interesting conclusions about the nature of winning and losing.
So we see how these abstract logical principles can have very concrete implications for strategy and the outcome of a game.
Right. It's like logic is providing the underlying rules for how to think about and analyze these strategic interactions, almost like a philosophical foundation for game theory.
Now, the deep dive then moves on to reasoning and expectations in games. And they use the Stag Hunt game as an example. Can you explain that briefly?
Sure. The stag hunt is this classic scenario where you have two players and they can either cooperate to hunt a stag together, which gives them a big reward, or they can each go off and hunt a hare on their own.
So the stag is the bigger prize, but it requires teamwork. The hare is a sure thing, but it's a smaller reward.
Exactly. Now, the interesting thing is that there are two stable outcomes, or what game theorists call Nash equilibria, in the stag hunt. One where both players cooperate and get the stag, and one where they both go for the hare.
So in both cases, neither player has an incentive to change their strategy if the other player sticks with theirs. But obviously, everyone's better off if they cooperate and get the stag.
Exactly. And the source highlights that which outcome actually happens often depends on the player's reasoning and expectations. Do they trust each other to cooperate? Do they think the other player will be greedy and go for the hare?
So it's not just about the possible actions and outcomes. It's also about the player's knowledge, beliefs, and how they reason about the situation. It really forces us to think like philosophers.
It does. It highlights the fact that even when cooperation is the best option for everyone, things can fall apart if there's a lack of trust or if expectations are misaligned.
And again, logic comes in to provide a framework for analyzing this. The source talks about thinking of different outcomes as possible worlds and using the relationships between those worlds to represent things like what a player knows, given their choice, or the range of options available to them.
Right. And what's interesting is that you can develop different logical systems depending on whose perspective you're taking. So the logic that describes what, say, player A knows and can do will be different from the logic for player E. It's like analyzing the game from multiple philosophical viewpoints.
I see. It's like considering different perspectives on the same problem, which is something philosophers do all the time.
Exactly. The source then dives into a bit more technical territory, mentioning a bimodal logic for matrix games with laws like KE, KA, Verfi, left, right, haro, K-A-K-E Varphy, saying it captures that grid structure. What's the core idea there?
Yeah, that one sounds a bit complex. Can you unpack that a bit for us?
Sure. So in a matrix game, the player's strategies and the outcomes are often laid out in a grid. This law basically captures the idea that in these games, the order in which we consider each player's knowledge doesn't really matter. So whether we look at what player E knows about what player A knows or vice versa, it all leads to the same overall understanding of their combined knowledge.
So it's a reflection of that symmetrical structure of the game. The knowledge flows in a very specific way.
Exactly. And of course, we can't forget about preferences. The source mentions preference logic and how it helps us define that key concept of Nash equilibrium.
Right, because our preferences, what we want, what we value, drive our choices in a game.
Exactly. Preference logic allows us to represent these preferences formally and see how they connect to the stability of different strategy combinations in a Nash equilibrium. The source also points out that the type of logic we use depends on the game structure. So, the logic for matrix games, where players choose their actions simultaneously, is different from the logic for extensive games, like those game trees where moves happen one after another.
Makes sense. Different structures, different logics.
Right.
Now, the next part of our deep dive gets into computation and games, and it talks about how interacting systems in computers can be modeled as games.
Yeah. This is where things get really interesting. Think about it, in modern computers, you have multiple processors or agents that are constantly interacting, sometimes working together, sometimes competing for resources. It's a lot like a game, right?
So each component is like a player with its own set of goals and preferences within the larger system.
Exactly. And this is where all the logical tools we've been talking about come in handy. They can be used to understand and design these complex computational systems by treating them as strategic interactions.
So game theory and logic aren't just for analyzing human behavior. They're essential for the design of complex systems as well.
Absolutely. And the influence goes both ways. Ideas from computer science, like complexity theory, have found their way into game theory, leading to the field of computational game theory. It's a really exciting area of research.
Now, our source then shifts the focus to what games can actually tell us about logic itself. It brings us back to the idea of argumentation and dialogue as being fundamental to logic.
Right. Just as logic provides tools to analyze games, games can also shed light on the nature of logical reasoning. At their core, argumentation and dialogue are interactive, just like games, and game theory offers techniques to study these logical interactions.
So we can use game theory to analyze logical arguments. That's pretty fascinating.
It is. And there are even specific types of games, like Ehrenfeucht-Fräse games, which are used in logic to compare different models. It goes even further. The processes of verifying logical statements and building logical models can themselves be framed as logic games.
So it's like the distinction between logic and games starts to blur a little.
Right. It leads to this really interesting debate about whether games are just a tool for analyzing logic or whether they're actually essential to its very meaning.
Right. The source talks about the weak thesis, which sees games as a useful technique, and the strong thesis, which goes much further and suggests that the meaning of some logical systems might actually be procedural, based on game-like interactions. That's a pretty radical idea.
It is. It challenges our traditional view of logic as being purely about truth and falsehood.
Okay, let's move on to how our source explores the structure of games. They start by talking about game forms, which don't even consider the players or agents involved yet. It's like looking at the bare bones of the game.
Exactly. Before we even introduce players and their motivations, there's this underlying structure. And the source contrasts two main ways of representing this: the extensive form, which is the game tree, and the strategic form, which is the matrix.
So the game tree shows the sequence of moves, the temporal unfolding of the game, while the matrix focuses on the possible strategies and the outcomes.
Right. One is about how the game is played, the other is about what happens when certain strategies are chosen. But the source also points out that there are other ways to think about game structure, like focusing on the inherent power of the players to bring about certain outcomes, regardless of the specific moves they make.
So it's about looking at the potential influence each player has on the game.
Exactly. And this leads to the concept of dissimulation. It's a way of determining when two game forms are essentially the same, structurally speaking.
So even if two games look different on the surface, they might be B-similar, meaning they have the same underlying structure and offer the same possibilities to the players.
Right. And the source points out that there are different levels of dissimulation. Some are very detailed, considering specific types of moves, while others are more general, just focusing on which player made a move.
It's like having different levels of magnification when looking at the structure of a game.
Exactly. You can zoom in and see every detail, or you can zoom out and get a more general overview.
Now, the next section delves into languages matching invariance relations, which seems to tie back to that earlier point about logic providing a language to describe games.
Right. The idea is that the way we choose to compare games, our invariance relation, should be reflected in the logical language we use to talk about them.
So, if we're using a fine-grained comparison like Bisimulation, which considers specific move types, then our logical language needs to be able to express those specific moves and their effects.
Exactly. The more distinctions our comparison method makes, the more expressive our logical language needs to be. The source gives examples using modal languages, which are really good at expressing possibilities and powers within games.
So, logic gives us the vocabulary to talk about the strategic nuances of a game.
Precisely. And this connection between logic and games gets even deeper. Because we're using logic, general results from logic can be applied to games. For example, the source mentions that if two game states are dissimilar, they will satisfy the same formulas in a suitable modal language. It's a really powerful connection.
It's like logic is creating a bridge between the structure of a game and our ability to describe and analyze it.
Exactly. And even basic logical laws take on new meaning in this context. The source revisits winning strategies and shows how, in a zero-sum game, saying that one player doesn't have a winning strategy is logically equivalent to saying that the other player does.
So logic can help us express fundamental game theoretic concepts in a very precise and elegant way.
It does. And the source mentions even more advanced logical tools, like fixed-point operators, that can capture the recursive nature of game theoretic equilibria.
Okay, the discussion then shifts to logics of power and preference, bringing the players back into focus.
Right. We've been talking a lot about the structure of games, but now we need to consider what players can actually do and what they want. The source introduces modalities for agentive power, like Varphy, which means that agent, I can force the game to a state where Varphy holds true.
So it's a way to formally describe a player's ability to influence the outcome, their strategic power.
Exactly. And there are logical systems that specifically deal with these powers. The source even mentions that basic logical equivalences, like the distributive law, can have direct counterparts in terms of power equivalences in games. It's a really neat connection.
It's like logic is mirroring the underlying structure of power in a game.
It is. Then the source introduces a modal language specifically designed for strategic form games. This language has tools to represent choices, uncertainty, and preferences.
So it's a comprehensive toolkit for analyzing these games.
Exactly. You can express a wide range of statements, like whether an outcome is possible, whether all outcomes satisfy a condition, or even whether a player's best outcomes have certain properties. And the source notes that in two-player games, there's a close connection between one player's choices and the other player's uncertainty.
Makes sense. What one player chooses determines what the other player doesn't know.
Exactly. And this is reflected in logical principles within the system. But the source also points out that things get a lot more complex when you go beyond two-player games. It can even become impossible to determine whether certain statements are true.
So the more players, the more complexity and the limits of what we can analyze using logic.
Right. The next part of the deep dive explores game algebra and dynamic logic. This is where we start thinking about how complex games can be broken down into simpler parts, like building blocks.
It's like taking a complex philosophical argument and breaking it down into smaller logical steps.
Exactly. The source introduces dynamic logic, inspired by computer science, which uses modalities like Varphy to mean that after playing game G, the condition holds true. And this logic has special rules that show us how these composite games behave. For example, playing game G followed by game G is logically equivalent to having the outcome of G hold after playing G.
So we can analyze these complex games by understanding how their simpler components interact.
Exactly. But the source does point out that things get trickier when you have imperfect information in a game.
Right, because if players don't know everything that's going on, it becomes harder to break the game down into neat subgames.
Exactly. Now, this whole section really highlights the incredible variety of logical perspectives we can apply to games. We can focus on outcomes, powers, temporal evolution, and each perspective has its own logical language.
So it's like having a whole toolbox of logical lenses to examine games from different angles.
Right. And the power of logic isn't just in creating these systems, it's also about connecting them, translating between them. This allows us to see how different levels of analysis relate to each other and how information updates change our understanding of the game.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the structure of games, but now the focus shifts more directly to the players themselves, to their preferences and their knowledge, what the source calls their epistemic dimensions.
Because ultimately, understanding strategic interaction isn't just about analyzing the game as some abstract entity. It's about understanding the agents who are playing the game, what they want, and what they know.
So we need to dive into those subjective aspects. Preferences, beliefs, reasoning processes. That's where things get really interesting.
Absolutely. And the source goes into this fascinating area of preference logics, which are specifically designed for games. It notes that traditional game theory often focuses on preferences over outcomes, but there's this growing trend in logic to consider preferences over more general propositions, not just the final results.
Right, because our preferences can be about more than just winning or losing. We might have preferences about the process of playing, the fairness of the rules, all sorts of things.
Exactly. Modal preference logic allows us to represent these more nuanced preferences using operators like Perseric, which means all outcomes at least as good as the current one for player I.
So we can capture a wider range of what players might value in a game.
Exactly. And these preference logics can be extended even further to include things like reasons for our preferences and how our preferences might change over time. But the source points out that even these extended logics aren't always enough to express key game theoretic ideas, like the concept of a best response.
Right, because the best response depends not just on your own preferences, but also on what you believe your opponents are going to do. It's a strategic concept.
Exactly. And to capture that, the source introduces this idea of an intersection modality. It combines preferences and uncertainty, allowing us to define precisely when a player's action is the best they can do, given their beliefs about their opponents.
So logic gives us a way to express that strategic thinking involved in choosing a best response.
It does. And then the source talks about the process of iterated removal of dominated strategies. It's a way of simplifying games by eliminating options that are never the best choice for a player, no matter what.
It's like clearing away the clutter to see the most important strategic choices.
Exactly. And the source distinguishes between strictly dominated strategies, where one choice is always better, and weakly dominated strategies, where one choice is at least as good and sometimes better.
So there are different levels of dominance, and they can affect the outcome of this simplification process.
Right. Removing strictly dominated strategies is pretty straightforward. But weakly dominated strategies are a bit trickier. The order in which you remove them can actually change the final outcome.
So even this seemingly simple strategic concept has some hidden complexities.
It does. Now, the source then introduces goals and beliefs as crucial elements in understanding player behavior. Goals give us a broader perspective on what players are trying to achieve, which might go beyond simple winning or maximizing immediate payoffs.
So it's about understanding their motivations, their ultimate aims in the game.
Exactly. And beliefs become really important when there's uncertainty about the game itself or about the other players. The source specifically mentions Stallnaker's work on belief revision.
Belief revision, that's about how we update our beliefs when we get new information, right?
Exactly. And in games, this is constantly happening. Players are observing each other, communicating, making inferences. Their beliefs are dynamic, and that's crucial to understanding how they reason about the game.
It's like we're constantly adjusting our internal models of the game and the other players as we go along.
Precisely. Now, the source then dives into uncertainty about moves and the idea of imperfect information. This is where players might not have a complete and accurate history of everything that's happened in the game.
So it's like playing a game where you don't have full visibility of the board or the other player's moves.
Right, and to represent this, the source introduces extensive games with imperfect information. They often use these things called indistinguishability relations between different states of the game.
So if two states are indistinguishable to a player, it means they can't tell them apart based on the information they have.
Exactly. But the source points out that even with imperfect information, there's this common assumption that players still know what moves are currently available to them. They might not know exactly how they got to that point in the game, but they know what they can do now.
Makes sense. You might be lost in the woods, but you still know which direction you can walk.
Exactly. Now, to handle this imperfect information, we need to extend our logical language. The source talks about the logic of imperfect information, which includes epistemic modalities like Key-Verfi, meaning agent I knows.
So now we can express things like player A knows that player B has made a certain move, or player B doesn't know the current score.
Exactly. And the source uses a great example of a children's guessing game to illustrate the difference between knowing a winning move d'array, meaning knowing that this specific move leads to a win, and knowing it de dicto, meaning knowing a general strategy that guarantees a win.
So you might have a winning move available, but you don't actually know that it's a winning move because you don't have all the information.
Precisely. And the source emphasizes that logic doesn't have to assume perfect memory. There are more advanced epistemic action languages that can handle situations where players forget things.
So we can model those more realistic scenarios where players are making decisions with limited information and imperfect recall.
Exactly. The discussion then touches on beliefs and plausibility. This is about adding more structure to how we represent uncertainty because players don't just know or not know things. They often have degrees of belief or a sense of how likely different possibilities are.
It's like having a spectrum of confidence rather than just black and white.
Right. And that's where plausibility orderings come in. They allow us to rank different possible states of the game based on how likely a player considers them to be.
So instead of just saying, I know this, or I don't know this, you can say, I believe this is more likely than that.
Exactly. And this richer structure allows us to define more nuanced modalities for belief. We can talk about what a player believes based on the most plausible states, and we can even talk about conditional belief, which is crucial for planning in uncertain situations.
So it's like saying, given what I currently believe, if this happens, then I would believe that.
Exactly. Now, the source then introduces type spaces. This is where things get a bit more mind-bending because we're dealing with higher order beliefs.
Higher order beliefs, that's like, I believe that you believe that I believe something, right?
Exactly. It's beliefs about beliefs about beliefs, and it can go on forever. And type spaces offer a way to model this whole hierarchy of beliefs. In a logical type space, an agent's type encodes their entire belief structure, including their beliefs about the other player's types, and so on. It's a very elegant way to represent this potentially infinite nesting of beliefs.
So it's like a snapshot of everyone's beliefs about everyone else's beliefs. Very meta.
It is. The source contrasts this first-person introspective view of type spaces with the third-person perspective often used in epistemic logic. And it notes that type spaces are usually static, meaning they don't capture how beliefs change over time. But integrating type spaces with dynamic epistemic logic is an active area of research.
So there's still a lot to explore in this realm of beliefs and knowledge in games.
Definitely. Now, the final part of this section on players looks at the limitations of real-world agents when it comes to reasoning, memory, and information processing. The source calls this bounded agency, or short sight.
Right, because we're not perfect logical machines. We have cognitive limitations.
Exactly. We can't think through every possible outcome, and we don't have unlimited memory. The source mentions some logical approaches to bounded agency, as well as game-theoretic models that represent bounded agents as finite state machines.
So we're starting to acknowledge those real-world constraints on our ability to reason strategically.
We are. And the section concludes by contrasting thin models of players, which focus on basic preferences and game structure, with thick models, which incorporate much more detail about knowledge, beliefs, and reasoning processes.
So depending on the question we're asking, we can choose the appropriate level of detail in our model.
Exactly. Sometimes a simple model is enough, but sometimes we need those richer, thicker models to capture the complexities of real players.
So, wow, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've seen how logic provides a really powerful toolkit for understanding games at all levels, from the basic structure to the complex reasoning of the players.
Absolutely. We've explored the history connecting logic and games, the various logical tools for analyzing strategic interactions, the links between computation and games, and even how games can teach us about logic itself.
We've looked at different representations of game structure, the role of power and preferences, and how to model uncertainty, beliefs, and even bounded rationality.
It's been quite a journey, and for you, the listener, we hope this has sparked some of those aha moments, those insights into why interactions, both in games and in life, unfold the way they do. By understanding these logical frameworks, you can approach strategic situations with more awareness and maybe even find new ways to navigate them.
It's like logic gives us a secret decoder ring for understanding the world around us.
In a way, it does. And what's really fascinating is that even simple games can have this hidden logical complexity. It makes you wonder, if we applied these logical principles more consciously to our everyday interactions, could we make better decisions, negotiate more effectively, understand each other better?
It's like we're all philosophers in a way, navigating this complex game of life.
We are, and this deep dive has just scratched the surface. If you're intrigued by this, there's a whole world of logic and games out there to explore.
So keep thinking, keep questioning, and keep playing those games, both literally and metaphorically.
And who knows, maybe you'll discover some new strategies, some new insights, some new ways to act as a philosopher in your own life.
Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive. We'll see you next time.
See you then.